elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 128. This is Connor flying solo for this episode to talk about an issue that we've just gone through, an experience that we've had, and some lessons learned, I think, that are applicable for a lot of other situations, your own life, our collective effort to try and increase freedom. And the topic for today is changing hearts and minds, a formula to make an impact. When people ask me what I do for a living, what we do at Libertas Institute, which is our think tank, I often say that we're in the business of changing hearts, minds, and laws. And the reason why I describe it that way is because early on I was focused on changing laws. And I discovered that you can find kind of strategic, tactical, clever ways to move the pendulum in one direction. You can sneak an amendment in. You can apply a lot of political pressure and twist some arms. You can, come up with ways to try and change a law. But what I found in a couple of instances is that because the culture hadn't changed, the belief system hadn't changed, the dynamics hadn't changed, what inevitably happened is that pendulum would swing back in the other direction because the opponents were still there. There was no real, ideological buy-in for your position. It just kind of happened to work out that way. And so then the law, got changed back and it wasn't really defensible. So I think it's really important as we try and increase freedom, as we try and defend our rights, that we have to do so by first, or at least at the same time, changing hearts and minds. There has to be a culture shift so that any laws that are changed are supported by the electorate or by a legislature, by the people who have some ability to change it. You wouldn't want them to suddenly have a, not even a change of heart, but say, oh, well, wait a minute. No, that's not what I believe. I actually support changing this back. So I think it's very important. And it's not without its concerns, because when you're changing hearts and minds, oftentimes you are sharing stories. You are presenting situations that are compelling, that are often personal, sympathetic. And I think those of us who adhere to principle and who try and think very rationally and logically often resist this because it's perceived that emotionalism is ripe for abuse, that it is a way to discard principles and just do what benefits that person with a sad story. And that's not without merit, right? Because we see on the so-called left quite often, especially with socialism, social programs, you see some young child that's destitute or hungry being put on a billboard and saying, oh, we need to support, Medicaid expansion or whatever the issue is. You see the plight of people used as a pretext for trying to often raise taxes and increase the size and scope of government. So it's not like this concern about emotionalism is unfounded. It's very founded. However, like anything, I think it's a tool. And that's like saying that because all the gangsters are using guns, we don't want to be associated with that, so we're going to use slingshots instead, or bows and arrows. I mean, no, a gun can be very useful, and just because it's being used wrongly by other people does not mean that it can't be used rightly by us. So I think it's very important to engage in storytelling, to be willing to show the impact that government can have in a negative way on people's lives. And to do that, we share their stories. We say, okay, look, I'll give you an example. Right now, we're working on this issue where we're going to ask the legislature to restrain cities from violating people's property rights, specifically when it comes to how they use their property in a variety of ways. For example, many cities arbitrarily set a limit as to how many dogs you can own, right? So they'll say, well, you can have 2 dogs or you can have 3. Now, they don't set limits on how many kids you can have. You can have extremely loud and rowdy and messy kids, but there's no limit on that. But suddenly when it comes to dogs, and you can have 5 totally quiet dogs that your neighbors have no idea about, but now you're a criminal because you've exceeded this arbitrary limit. So we're going to try and, get the legislature to say, okay, well, wait a minute, cities, you can't do this without cause. You can't do this unless there's a nuisance. Otherwise, let people just do what they want on their property unless they're bothering their neighbors. So as part of that, we're finding stories. We found the story of this one woman, and her pet was a goat, a little pygmy goat. And basically like a little doggy. It was this little novelty. All the neighbors loved it. She'd take it on a walk. It would kind of bounce around. And however, in their city, the code did not allow for goats within a residential area. And so she was told by animal control. There was one neighbor behind her who didn't like it. It wasn't like there was a ongoing problem or constant noise or anything like that. But the neighbor called animal control. Animal control came and said, "Well, you can't have a goat. It's not allowed." She had to get rid of her goat. Now, as silly as that may sound to you and I, for her it was extremely personal because she had bonded with this little animal. It was part of the family, and Pepper Paisley, I think, is what they named her. And it was like a little doggy, right? It just happened to be a goat, but they'd feed it and walk it and play with it, and I mean, it was basically like the family pet. And everyone loved it. It was a fun little animal to have. So they had deeply bonded with it. And then here comes the city to say, you got to get rid of it. And that was traumatic for the family. It was very sad for them that they couldn't keep this goat. So that shows the problem. It shows harm. It shows how an arbitrary or overbearing or flat out stupid government policy can harm a person. And I think that story is important because and this is the first big lesson that I want to talk about that I've had is the importance of humanizing things. In our next episode, we're going to talk about immigration and this whole caravan thing. And we've talked in past episodes as well about the propensity of our ideological opponents, if you will, to dehumanize others, whether we're talking about war or immigration or whatever. It's very easy to dehumanize other people and and then try and suppress in your own mind this idea that they have rights or feelings or family or anything of the sort. All of this lesson was borne out to me primarily, and the reason why I wanted to do this episode was through as a result of the campaign we just wrapped up here in our state of Utah to legalize medical cannabis. We've been at this for several years and had a ballot initiative, and it passed. And then we had kind of a big compromise negotiation, and that passed. And as a result, we, over the past 5 years, have shifted public opinion on medical cannabis from the high 40s. In other words, 47, 48% of voters in Utah 5 years ago supported medical marijuana, to now it's in the mid 80s. Now, we can't take full credit for that, obviously, because the national conversation has been ongoing. There's been a lot of media attention and so forth. And so it's part of kind of a broader effort. However, we employed several very specific strategies to shift people here in conservative, religious Utah to embrace what otherwise is considered as this, addictive gateway drug. And chief among them was the importance of humanizing the issue. And to do that, we shared stories. Specifically, we shared patient stories. We shared stories of veterans who were on horrible prescription drugs with side effects. We shared stories of epileptic children whose drugs didn't even really work and had poor side effects. We shared stories of folks with cancer, of old ladies with chronic pain. I mean, on and on and on. All of this suffering, the opioid crisis, right? We could connect it to all these issues and share stories to say, my gosh, why can't we let these people try? Why shouldn't they have the right to try? It's as simple as that. We're not asking for anything more than just saying, just leave them alone. Look, if they're a patient, just let them be. Let them go try this. Don't throw them in jail just because they're trying to get off of, heavy amounts of prescription drugs and try an alternative that people like them in another state, people with their condition, are using, and they've weaned themselves off of these other drugs and they're managing their symptoms and life is great. Why shouldn't our friend here in Utah, in our state, have the right to try? So lots of storytelling, and it humanized the issue substantially, right? Because growing up with these DARE programs, just say no and all this stuff, drug users were kind of branded as these kind of, ne'er-do-wells who, are lurking among us in the shadows and so forth. And when you bring them out and say, well, wait a minute, there's all sorts of drug users. Just because it has the blessing of the FDA, we still have all this drug dependency. We have people going to the street. We have addicts. This is kind of a much more mainstream issue than was previously anticipated. So storytelling, that was very important. We have to humanize the issue. We have to show that the people who are suffering are human. They're just like us. And that leads to the second issue, that the other thing that I wanted to share about changing hearts and minds as kind of a basis for affecting this large scale change. So we have to humanize the issue, but we also, I think, have to personalize the issue. Okay, we can't just show that these people are like us. We have to draw a connection between them and the person we're talking to, in this case, the voter, right? Maybe it's a legislator, maybe it's a reporter. We have to draw a connection. Now, fortunately for us in this campaign, that wasn't too difficult, because we all know people, right, who have cancer or who have pain or who have epilepsy, or MS or PTSD, any of these conditions that would be covered. It was very easy, because especially as these people start sharing their stories, it emboldened more people to share their own. And so suddenly what you had is people around the dinner table talking about this issue. And, oh man, this would benefit Aunt Susie. And, oh, my coworker, Bob, is going through cancer right now, and his chemo is awful, and he's wasting away. He can't keep any food down. He has nausea. He should be able to try this stuff, because I know it could help, and so on and so on and so on. And so when you personalize the issue, what we found, it was really interesting. In our case here in Utah, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon church, has a lot of political influence, as you can imagine. And when they came out in opposition to our effort, it was really interesting, because you had a lot of people who are of that faith who felt torn because they felt like, well, oh man, I should do what my church is counseling me to do. It within the Mormon faith, it's this very strong belief that the church authorities are speaking for God as prophets and so forth. And so you had people who felt very conflicted, because they were being told by their church authorities that this is a bad thing. But then on the other hand, because it was such a personal issue, you had them saying, well, but wait a minute, why shouldn't grandma, in her horrible arthritis, be able to take a little cannabis chocolate before bed to try and get some sleep so she can have relief? And so you had this conflict within people that was gnawing at them. Otherwise, without that emotional, personal, human connection, in our case, people just would have said, oh yeah, no, that's fine. If the church says it's bad, then clearly there must be something bad with it. But there was that internal conflict, because people were so drawn to the personal side of this. The other issue, the third issue that I'll mention in today's episode, is the importance of persistence. I've seen this time and again when people are trying to endeavor or embark, I should say, on large campaigns or large issues, trying to do something big. There are a lot of flashes in the pan, right? There's a lot of people who start and then peter out. There's a lot of people who will write an op-ed or do a social media post or whatever and then fizzle out. What we need to do if we sincerely want to change hearts and minds is to be persistent. My late grandfather was fond of acronyms. He would have, all sorts of acronyms. KTYL, know that you're loved, and he would have all these different acronyms. The one that I'm fondest of the most, that I've kind of embraced as my own, is PPPG. That stands for persistence pays pretty good, and it was one of the adages from my granddad. And I have seen that borne out in spades, right? Persistence pays pretty good. Basically, stay at it. Stay the course. Plan for the long haul. Don't peter out. Maybe you have to go into a period of, less activity. Maybe you have to scale things back, but keep at it, because when you keep at it, you keep the issue in the forefront of people's minds. You keep the conversation going. You keep drawing people's attention to that issue. And over time, circumstances will change, and there will be events that transpire that you're able to then fold into your campaign. So for example, let's just keep using medical cannabis. So we're working on the medical cannabis campaign, and then there's a woman in a wheelchair who gets arrested. And suddenly we can fold that immediately into the conversation that we have kept going. It's basically like keeping a fire going, right? You got to keep the fire going so people know that there's heat. They know it's there. They can smell it. They can feel it. They know it's not going away. And they know if they don't do something, it's going to spread. But then this story happens, and it's the gasoline. And we can pour gasoline on the fire, and suddenly, we have a wildfire. We have a brush fire in people's minds, right? And so I think that's the importance of persistence, making sure that when those events happen, you can immediately pivot. You can latch onto these things. You can utilize them for your cause and say, it's like we've been saying all along, X, Y, and Z, right? We got to, And so you can react. You can jump on these issues. You can leverage them, take advantage of them because you've been persistent, because you've been maintaining that conversation. If you let something die off and it falls outside of the zeitgeist, the public mind, people aren't paying attention anymore, you have to kind of re-educate people. You have to bring it up again. Or a reporter's going to say, oh, yeah, and there was a bill that was run 3 years ago. Or, oh, yeah, there was a protest that was done, a year and a half ago. And they may draw the connection to your previous effort. But if it shows that it's disconnected and isolated and kind of infrequent, that doesn't give the psychological impression that there's demand. If there's demand, then there's going to be people knocking on the door all the time. There's going to be people who are nonstop doing something about this. You have to show demand. You have to show people that they have to tackle this issue. They have to confront their biases. They have to confront their fears, their ignorance, whatever, because you're not going away. And that is so important. I mean, if you're up at the Capitol, if you're talking to reporters, if you're doing protests, if you're just doing cottage meetings, directly grassroots stuff, you have to help people understand that you're not going away. And that simple act alone will require them eventually, sooner or later, to confront your issue, to talk to you, to understand what you're all about, to quantify and kind of put in a box like, who is this person? What are they doing? I need to figure out what I think about this issue. So persistence. So the three of them are, we have to humanize these issues, we have to personalize them, and we have to be persistent about them. If we're really wanting to change hearts, minds, and laws, we have to have a game plan. We have to identify these things. But this doesn't have to be just for a big campaign. And I guess my call to action for all of you, for myself included, is to try this out just on social media, just in our circle of friends, whatever issue we're passionate about, whichever thing we want to persuade people about. Take a moment and think about how we can humanize the issue. What is a story we can find and share and highlight? Maybe write an op-ed based around that story and say, look, I want to share this story, and here's the implications. Here's why this matters. Here's what we should do about it. Print that op-ed out or email the link to your legislator and say, what are you going to help me do about this? Hey, can we meet? Come on over. Let's talk about it. Maybe it's your city councilman. Maybe it's a reporter. Say, hey, you guys should do a feature story about this case. Look, I just did a write-up, but you ought to pay attention to this. Reporting is all about storytelling, right? And so you have to captivate people's attention. So in your personal life, it's not that you're maybe engaged in a big political campaign. You've got a job, you've got a family, whatever. But in your interactions for the causes and issues that you care about, what are ways that you can humanize this issue for other people? What are ways that you can personalize it for them? Find ways that in their own life, they are affected by this. Someone they love or care about is affected by this. And then be persistent. Talk about it a lot, not excessively, but don't let it slip. Come at it from different angles. Keep talking about it. Let people know that you care. Let people know that you're not going away. Draw them into your cause. Find people who are like-minded. Grow what you're trying to do. All of us can do something like that. We can start small. We can grow big. But my challenge to you, to me, is to remember that for as much as all of us like to complain about laws and restrictions and regulations and so forth, at the end of the day, the problem is that we have lost people's hearts and minds. They have been propagandized in the schools. They have been made callous, by the media. They have been persuaded by poor doctrine and ideas that we've not combated very well. I think we need to be telling better stories. I think we need to be humanizing these issues even more and showing what government can do and how it can harm people. And so that's something that we are taking into council, kind of lessons learned from this big campaign and effort that we just wrapped up. I hope it's useful to you. And I hope you stick around for the next episode because, as I said, we're going to be talking about some of these issues as it applies to this caravan of immigrants that we've been hearing about all over the news for the past couple of months, and the issue more broadly, to kind of give a little snapshot about how some of these ideas can apply to a hot topic. So make sure you're subscribed, share the podcast with your friends. Thanks for sticking around, guys. This is Society and the State. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.